Towards the end of the First Age, Middle-earth would have to persevere through the greatest war in its entire history, as the Free People and the forces of the Valar led a grueling assault upon the fortress of Angband to overthrow and defeat the Dark Lord Morgoth. They would have to face and push through many hardships in order to achieve their victory, and even then it was bittersweet, for it came at a heavy price. Even though Morgoth was finally defeated, the effects of his corruption would live on, and many of his servants, such as the men that he had twisted into his service, remained loyal to their master's teachings. And so, Morgoth's influence would persist like a shadow over these lands, and many of the lands of Middle-earth would suffer permanent scars from the war to overthrow him. Now, even though many of the factions and tribes of men had fought under Morgoth's banner in this war, there were some men that were brave enough to oppose him, and these were the three houses of the Edain. These men had shown tremendous courage by fighting side by side with the Valar and the rest of the Free People, and for their loyalty, the Valar rewarded them with many gifts. Their first gift was knowledge, for the Valar sent out the Herald of Manwë, called Eonwë, to walk amongst these men, and he taught them many new skills, arts, and wisdom. Their second gift was a longer lifespan, which was 3 times that of other men, and the Edain would also be immune to sickness and disease for as long as they remained faithful to the Valar. And finally, their last gift was a special land which they could call home, an island that was raised out of the very depths of the ocean for them. It was located between Aman and Middle-earth, and its shape resembled a 5-pointed star, and it was, by far, one of the most beautiful lands of men. This island was enriched by the Valar Yavanna, while Aule tended to its foundations, and the elves of Tol Eressëa brought flowers and fountains to enliven it. And through all their hard work, it became a mesmerizing sight, and it was known as Andor, the Land of the Gift. Now, while all of this was happening, the Edain were waiting patiently in Middle-earth for a sign that their home was finally ready for their arrival. They were promised that when the time was right, the star of Eärendil would shine so brightly that it would overwhelm all the other stars in the sky, so much so that it alone could be seen. By following this star, the Edain would find their new home across the great ocean, though this body of water would prove to be quite a challenge for these men, for back then they weren't skilled in the arts of shipbuilding or sailing. Luckily, their elven allies came to their aid, for Círdan the shipwright provided them with some boats, and he assigned elven captains to sail these men across the sea. Even the Valar would help them along this great journey by using their power to calm the ocean and by guiding their boats to this island. At first, only a few of the Edain were ready to take on this journey, and they would finally reach their home in the year 32 of the Second Age. Over the next 50 years, the rest of their people would slowly migrate across the Great Sea to join their brethren, and they would call this island Anadune, or Númenor in High Elvish, and this name meant Westernesse in the common speech. Now, these men would need a king to lead them, and Elros, the half-elven, was seen as the perfect candidate, for he was a descendant of all 3 houses of the Edain, and he was the son of Eärendil and Idril. He was also the twin brother of Elrond, and these 2 siblings were offered an interesting choice that would lead them down very different paths in their lives. For, since they were half-elven, they would have to choose between the fate of men and that of the elves. And while Elrond chose to be an elf, his brother Elros embraced the fate of men, and he gave up his immortality. Even though he was now mortal, Elros would still have a much longer lifespan than the other Númenóreans because of his half-elven heritage, and he lived to be 500 years old. He would pass down this longevity to his children, and this is why the royal line of Númenor lived far longer than the rest of their people. It's also worth mentioning that, despite their long lifespan, the Númenórean population would grow very slowly, for they would typically have very few children. Now, the capital city of Númenor was called Armenelos, and it was built in the centre of the island near the base of the holy mountain of Meneltarma. This city was by far the most beautiful on the island, and it was enriched by gifts from the elves of Tol Eressëa, for they would sometimes sail out to Númenor. Some of their gifts were riches such as gems, gold and silver, which were rare and highly prized in Númenor, while others were more simplistic and practical, such as fragrant flowers, herbs of great power, and birds of song. They even gave Malorn seeds to the Númenóreans, and on this island they grew taller and thicker than any of the Malorn trees of Middle-earth. And one of their most symbolic gifts was actually a seedling of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in Tol Eressëa, and the Númenóreans planted this seedling in the courts of the king, where it blossomed and it became a symbol of the kings of Númenor. Now, as the years passed by, the Númenóreans slowly became great sailors, divers and shipbuilders, and they were eager to master their crafts. In order to improve their skill, they combined all of the knowledge that they had learned from the elves with their own experience and studies, and this allowed their talents to grow at an incredible rate. By now, the glory and wisdom of the Númenóreans was unmatched by any other men, and they were becoming more like the elves in all things as they sought to reach new levels of mastery. They were determined to reach new lands, and their confidence grew as they sailed further and further away, for with each journey they surpassed their own achievements. The time would soon come for the Númenóreans to finally return to the shores of Middle-earth, and in the year 600 of the Second Age, the first Númenórean ships set sail on this journey, and they reached the elven haven of Mithlond. They were greeted by Gil-galad, the high elven king of the Noldor, and out of this meeting, a great friendship and alliance was born between the men of Númenor and the elves of Lindon. News would quickly spread across the land that the Númenóreans had returned to Middle-earth, and when it reached the men of Eriador, they were filled with wonder. These men were distantly related to the Númenóreans, for they also were descendants of the Edain. However, their ancestors had never crossed the Blue Mountains to enter the land of Beleriand, choosing instead to remain in Eriador, and so they grew isolated from their kinsmen. They were surprised to hear that their kinsman was still alive, for they had thought that none of the Edain of Beleriand had survived the terrible onslaught and destruction of the War of Wrath. And they sent messengers to Gil-galad to arrange a meeting with the Númenóreans. The men of Eriador were somewhat wary of this meeting, for most of their people were scared of the Númenóreans, thinking that they were perilous spirits of the dead, and only 12 of their men were brave enough to meet them. When they finally met each other at the Tower Hills, all of their fears quickly vanished, as they stood silently and in awe. For in their eyes, the Númenóreans looked like noble elf lords rather than mortal men, though they had no doubt that these were truly their ancient kinsmen. The men of Númenor were equally surprised, for they were unaware that there were still men in Middle-earth that weren't descendants of the evil men that had served Morgoth, and a friendship would slowly grow between these two people. Many of the bravest and most daring of the Númenóreans became sailors, and they yearned for adventure and for the thrill of exploring new lands. They would soon become the greatest sailors in the history of Arda, and they wanted to explore and travel to every corner of the world. And yet, the Númenóreans weren't able to do so. Not due to some lack of courage or skill, for the Númenóreans had these in plenty, but it was because of a ban that the Valar had placed upon them. For when the Valar had first raised the island of Númenor from the sea, they banned the Númenóreans from travelling so far into the west that the coast of Númenor could no longer be seen. It might seem like this ban was unfair to the Númenóreans, but it was actually for their own good, For if the Númenóreans tried to seek out the Undying Lands, they would desire to live in this paradise, and they would grow jealous and yearn for the immortality of the elves, which would make them disregard and hate their own gift of mortality, and they might try to overpass their limits. At first, the Númenóreans were content to respect and follow this ban, even though they couldn't understand its purpose, and they satisfied their desire for adventure by travelling to the outermost northern, southern, and eastern borders of Arda. They saw the great deserts in the south of Middle-earth, the gates of morning in the east, and it's also implied that they sailed to the Dark Land, a mysterious continent that lay to the south of Middle-earth. As they explored more of the lands of Middle-earth, the Númenóreans came across some tribes of men that were still living under the shadow of Morgoth. They were primitive, weak, and they lived in fear, and when the Númenóreans saw their decrepit state, they took pity on them, and they tried to help them by sharing their knowledge. They showed them how to order their lives, and they shared skills and tools for cutting and planting trees, shaping stone and grinding grain. And they even gave them gifts, such as wine and corn. To gain the trust of these men, the Númenóreans would come unarmed to their lands, leaving behind their axes and bows, and with their help, these primitive men were able to slowly free themselves from the shackles of Morgoth, as they found comfort in the help and knowledge of the Númenóreans. The Númenóreans would only spend a short amount of time in these lands, for back then they wouldn't build settlements in Middle-earth, and so they would have to eventually set sail for Númenor. As they left these lands, the primitive men would pray and hope for their return, for in their eyes the Númenóreans seemed like gods, and they would cherish the memory of the tall Númenórean kings. One of the most influential kings of Númenor was Aldarion, for through his efforts Númenor's naval power grew significantly. He was a man that yearned for adventure and exploration, and he loved the sea more than land. And on his first expedition he set sail for Lindon, where he met Gil-galad, and a strong friendship grew between them. While he was in Lindon, Aldarion tried to learn as much as he could from Círdan the shipwright about building and managing ships, and during his visit Aldarion gave Gil-galad some Malorn seeds as a gift. These seeds weren't able to grow in the land of Lindon, and so Gil-galad gave some of them to Galadriel, and this is actually how the great Malorn forests of Lothlorien came to be. Aldarion would spend many long years out at sea, as he explored the lands of Middle-earth and helped its people, and many of the kings of these lands rewarded him with riches to thank him for his help. When he returned to Númenor, Aldarion applied all of the knowledge that he learned from Círdan to improve the Númenorian ships and to strengthen their harbours. And in the year 750, Aldarion established the Guild of Venturers. They were a brotherhood of sailors that would work together to accomplish a common goal that was beyond the capabilities of a single ship. And while all this was happening, Aldarion was still a prince of Númenor. King Meneldur disapproved of his son's obsession with sailing and his long journeys away from home, for he felt that Aldarion was choosing adventure over his duties, and so a rift would grow between father and son. The king tried to oppose Aldarion by setting a limit on the amount of trees that could be cut down for wood, for he hoped that by slowing down the rate of their shipbuilding, he might discourage his son's foolish dreams. Yet all of this only hardened Aldarion's will, and he realized that if his plans were to succeed, he had to build a shipyard in Middle-earth. And so, Aldarion set sail for the coasts of Middle-earth, and he came across a forest near the river called the Grey Flood, and he decided to establish the haven of Vignalonde in this land. The Númenóreans had finally secured a source of wood to build and repair their ships, and as they began to cut down the trees in this forest, a problem would soon arise. For this forest was home to some native men, and at first they endured the loss of their habitat peacefully, though eventually the devastation to their forest became too great, and these wild men rose up and started to ambush and attack the Númenóreans. They were obviously outmatched, and their attacks drove the Númenóreans to become more ruthless in their tree cutting, and the wild men had no choice but to flee their lands and try to find some refuge in Dunland. Even though the Númenóreans had inflicted unimaginable damage to these forests, they felt that it was a necessary evil to prepare for war. For a rumour had reached Aldarion that some lord of Middle-earth was gaining power, and that he bore a terrible hatred for the Númenóreans. There were also rumours that the primitive men of Middle-earth, whom the Númenóreans had once helped, were now growing afraid of them once more, and some of them were even becoming openly hostile, using the very tools that the Númenóreans had shared with them to harass their forces. It was now of the utmost importance for Aldarion to return to Númenor, though after he set sail, his ships were faced with a terrible storm, and it drove them to the north, where they made port in Lindon. Something strange was afoot, and Aldarion decided to meet with Gil-galad to discuss this new threat. It was clear that some new evil was rising in the east, and every year it was drawing more and more men into its service as its power grew. It seemed to Aldarion that this was probably some tyrant of men, though in his wisdom Gil-galad knew better, for he knew that this was no mere man, but an ancient, evil servant of Morgoth that was stirring once more. And he believed that the day would soon come when this threat would be too great for the elves to handle alone. They felt that the main weakness in their defensive front was a small gap in the land of Calenarthorn, and it seemed that this was one of the reasons why Aldarion had chosen the Greyflood as his haven, for through it he would be able to secure the land and sea in this region, and negate their weakness. Since their defensive strategy was ready, it was now crucial that Aldarion sailed in all haste to Númenor to deliver a letter to his father, the king, informing him about this dire threat. As they set sail, his ships would once more have to face terrible storms that drove them into the icy cold wastelands in the north, though eventually the sea and wind relented, and Aldarion managed to make his way to Númenor, where he delivered this letter to his father. When King Meneldur read this letter, he felt that his understanding of this new threat wasn't sufficient to be able to take the important decisions that would lay ahead, and so he believed that the time was ripe for him to resign from his kingship so that Aldarion could succeed him. It seems that in the years that followed, Aldarion kept strengthening the Númenorian fleet, though this great war with Sauron wouldn't occur during his lifetime, for it would actually take place over 500 years after Aldarion's death, during the reign of Queen Telperion, the 10th ruler of Númenor. After Sauron managed to deceive the elves of Eregion into creating the Rings of Power, he planned to launch an attack upon their city to claim all of the Lesser Rings. This attack would take place in the year 1693, and Sauron's armies slaughtered the elves of Eregion, destroyed their home, and he tortured Celebrimbor for information on these rings. Despite all of this torture and suffering, Celebrimbor refused to give up the location of the 3 elven rings, though this wouldn't stop Sauron, for he was able to guess that they were probably hidden with the great elven lords of Eriador. It seemed to Sauron that his best chance of seizing the elven rings of power was to attack the city of Lindon, and in the year 1695 he led his armies westward, ravaging all the lands in their path. And as they marched towards Lindon, Sauron left a small force to besiege Rivendell, to keep Elrond occupied and to stop him from coming to Gil-galad's aid. The elves of Lindon were prepared for Sauron's attack, for Gil-galad had already set plans in motion to defend his lands. He had sent out a messenger to Númenor, asking for their aid, and the Númenóreans had set up a significant force upon the shores of Lindon, together with many supplies. Even so, this wouldn't be enough to hold back the terrible armies of Sauron, for the great navy of Númenor hadn't arrived yet, and it was a crucial part in their defensive strategy. The Queen's nephew, called Minastyr, had already ordered the great fleet of Númenor to sail to Lindon, though they were slowed down by delays, and they would only reach the shores of Middle-earth in the year 1700. By then, Sauron had almost conquered all of Eriador, apart from Rivendell, and his forces had reached the River Lune near the borders of Lindon. The elves of Lindon, together with their Númenórean allies, were desperately trying to hold this line, and it seemed like they were moments away from being overwhelmed. Though luckily, the great fleet of Númenor arrived at the shores of Lindon in the nick of time, and they turned back the tide of this battle, and Sauron's army suffered a devastating defeat and were driven back. Now Sauron wouldn't have a chance to retreat, for some of the Númenórean ships had landed at the Greyflood, and this allowed them to attack Sauron's armies from behind, and so they were forced to fight on two fronts. In the battle that followed, all of Sauron's forces were utterly routed, and even Sauron himself barely managed to escape alive. This was a tremendous victory for the Free People, and with this victory, the Númenóreans tasted their power in Middle-earth. In the years that followed, they began to set up permanent settlements on its western coasts, and they became so powerful that Sauron was forced to remain in Mordor for hundreds of years. Minastyr would eventually succeed his aunt, and in the year 1731, he became the 11th ruler of Númenor. He was a good king, and he loved the elves dearly, though he was also jealous of their immortality, and he would spend a great part of his days gazing into the west at the undying lands, yearning for something that he could never have. This was a turning point in the history of Númenor, for as their power grew, the Númenóreans started to give more attention to some of their more subtle, darker desires. The Númenóreans were great. The Númenóreans were powerful. Why not immortal? A desire that would one day lead to the utter ruin of their nation. Though that is a story for another time. So this wraps up today's video, and we hope you enjoyed it. How do you guys feel about the rise of Númenor? And do you think that any of these events that we mentioned would eventually play a part in their downfall? Also, do you believe that this story might be featured in the upcoming Amazon series? And if so, are you excited to watch it? As always, we'd like to give a quick shout out to all the patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help makes this channel possible, and your support is deeply appreciated. Particularly the Valar tier patrons, Jacob Williams, Michael Angel, and T. Gorman, and the Wizard tier patrons, James Stodgel, Andrew Burma, Mike Feeney, Roland Meervold, and Tamar Baines. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, we'll be leaving a link to the Patreon page in the video description. You could also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. Until next time, when we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.